The Jurymen, an original story written and read by Miss Worm. The winter of 1920 had been relentlessly damp, even for London, and the weather had wormed its way into my thigh, settling itself in the bone. It was 5 years since I had been wounded at Gallipoli and left with a tin leg below the knee and constant pain above it. A time came at the end of March when I'd spent 6 consecutive nights in the fireside chair, unable to find comfort in my bed. When sleep did come, I would soon wake in a feverish sweat, with half-remembered horrors lurking, with tooth and claw, at the edges of my mind. The pain left me with little appetite or ability for routine work, so I fell back on my first love, archaeology. When I found myself awake at 3 a.m, as I so often did, I would drag my typewriter to the table and immerse myself in my recording of the pagan history of Sussex. 3 a.m, undoubtedly the most accursed hour of all. "Bad night again, sir?" Finch cleared a path through my papers and began laying the table for breakfast. "I'm afraid so. It's this blasted false foot of mine. This dismal weather isn't helping. Begging your pardon, sir, but staying cooped up in here for days on end can't be helping. You should get yourself out for a walk." If anyone else had said such a thing, I would have given them short shrift. But Finch and I had known each other a long time. He'd been my batman during the war, and we'd kept in touch after I'd been invalided home. When the conflict stumbled to its finish, he found himself in want of work, as so many men did, so I'd engaged him as a general manservant. It served us both well. There was no need to explain my night terrors to Finch, and his sudden attacks of mental paralysis were eased by a day or two of complete rest. "There's a new bookshop just opened along the road, sir. From what I've heard, they've got some right choice works on English folklore." I had to laugh at that. He knew me too well. It's often said that a man who is tired of London is tired of life, and Finch was proved correct. The sights and sounds of our great city soon distracted me from dwelling on my infirmity. The summit of my expedition proved to be a bookshop of the traditional variety, with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with a sublime selection of historical and archaeological tomes. The owner, Chandler, was wounded at Ypres and wore one of those miraculous face masks from the Tin Nose shop. I banged my leg with my cane, a fine bamboo swordstick that had belonged to my father, in order to offer my understanding, and needless to say, we fell to talking about the war. He showed me to a seat in his parlour at the rear of the shop and scurried back and forth, bringing me books he thought might appeal to me. He certainly knew his trade, and I spent far more than I ought. "Hello, is that Robinson?" said a voice at my elbow, and I whirled around. "Maddox, good Lord, I thought you'd gone up to Scotland to grow turnips. What are you doing in London?" During our shared time at Oxford, growing turnips in Scotland had been a popular euphemism for having died. His regiment was at Passchendaele, and I hadn't caught wind of him since, so naturally I assumed the worst. "Turnips? Not me. I've been living it up in Suffolk." He laughed, but his mirth didn't reach his eyes, which held a haunted, almost hunted look behind them. It was a condition seen in nearly every other man who came back from the front, and I dare say it applied to me, too, if I'd ever cared to consult a mirror. "What have you been up to? Have you—" "I can't stop, old chap, but I'm down again next month. Tell you what, I'll meet you here, and then we can go on somewhere and catch up." Yes, of course. I shall look forward to it," I said, though I expected him to brush me off. It wasn't uncommon. Some men hated to be reminded of their life before the war. We agreed to meet 30 days later, and he left as abruptly as he'd entered. My brief excursion exhausted me, and no sooner had I returned home than I slept for 3 glorious, dreamless hours. Finch brought me a cup of tea when he heard me up and about. "Do you remember Maddox?" I asked him. "I bumped into him at the bookshop." Maddox. I believe so, sir. 3 brothers, was it?" "Yes, that's right. Thomas, the youngest, was at Oxford with me, reading mathematics. Rather a brilliant chap. What happened to the other 2? Do you know? I met the eldest brother, Hugh, a few times." "They bought it in Belgium, sir. The eldest had only just got wed too. Pretty girl, by all accounts." "Trust you to know the gossip, Finch. You must tell me all, so I don't put my tin foot in it, though I'm not convinced he'll keep our appointment." "As I heard it, sir, they were all together when the Germans caught them in no man's land. Thomas carried one brother back to the trenches, but there was nothing could be done. Took a bullet clean through the head. Never found the other brother, poor bloke." My visit to Chandler's bookshop invigorated me, and for the next few weeks I lived almost solely on tea and tobacco, and did nothing but research and type. The bookshop proved invaluable, and Chandler was a fount of information on Sussex, his family having originated from that part of the world. Work consumed me, and my chance meeting with my old friends slipped my mind until Finch tapped on the door. "Will you be in for lunch, sir, or are you and Mr. Maddox planning to dine out?" "Is that today? Thank goodness you reminded me. Doubtless he'll let me down, but I'd better show willing just in case. You can fix me up with bread and soup if I return early." "From what I've heard of him, sir, that wouldn't be too bad a thing." With a weary sigh, I jotted down a few notes, placed a marker in my book, and made my way out. "Good morning, sir." "Morning, Chandler. Anything interesting coming over the last week?" "Well now, it so happens that I've come across somewhat of an unusual find. I put it by for you, sir, in case you wanted first refusal." He reached under the counter and pulled out as decrepit a pile of papers as I'd ever seen. "Gentleman brought it in only yesterday." Chandler ran his fingers over the stiff paper with the loving caress of a true bibliophile. "I was going to send a note round to you this afternoon. Not much left of the binding, sir, but the interior's more or less intact." The cover, such as it was, comprised a few dishevelled strips of leather and cotton, and the pages themselves, of which there were no more than 100, were badly foxed and watermarked. The frontispiece, etched by a highly skilled engraver, depicted a sun-dappled glade in dense woodland, in which stood a stone circle of 12 irregular monoliths. To one side of this was a larger slab with a basin-like dip in its top. My pulse quickened. Was this an altar? Better yet, this was not a henge I recognised. I searched for the description of the illustration. The centre of the circle, 1724, was all it said. My eyes swept across to the title page. "The Lost Rings of Sussex, commissioned by Edward Tuppen, Vicar of Applewick, 1723. "You've outdone yourself, Chandler," I said, forgetting the first rule of haggling. "I knew you'd appreciate it, sir. It's my belief there's not another like it." "Hello, Robinson. Found yourself a treasure?" In my delight at the Lost Rings of Sussex, I had not heard the shop bell jangle, nor noticed the step of Maddox behind me. "My word, I believe I have." "Careful," he laughed, "or he'll charge you double." I think I did a fair enough job of hiding my surprise at Maddox's turning up, and we exchanged the usual pleasantries. Within a few minutes, our awkwardness dissolved, and we fell back into our old friendship from university days, and the morning was spent, as the best mornings are, in companionable society, surrounded by books. Our conversation kept to mutual friends we knew had survived the carnage of war and influenza, and neither of us mentioned family. "You know, Robinson, seeing you has done me a power of good." He'd found himself an armful of books, and we stood watching Chandler package them up at the counter. I confess, I was at a low ebb. A damned low ebb. His gaze fell, and the light left his eyes before he brought himself up sharply. "Look, why not come up to Suffolk for a few weeks in the summer? Bring that typewriter of yours and see if you can finish that book." Yes, all right, I could do with a holiday, I agreed impulsively. If I might, sir, interjected Chandler, my sister has a place in Sussex that may interest you. He tapped the neatly wrapped parcel that contained my new book. Just outside Applewick. I turned to Maddox. Might it not be dull for you if I'm poking through the undergrowth looking for a new Stonehenge? There's plenty of good river fishing, added Chandler. Fine walks on the downs, too. Fishing? Sold, laughed Maddox. My sister will be happy to oblige for you, sir. She's a capital cook, and likes nothing better than having gentlemen to fuss over. Then it's settled. My Batman Finch will do for us, and Chandler's sister, Mrs. Hobden, sir. Mrs. Hobden will see us fed and watered. Tell your sister to expect us for 2 weeks at the start of August. I tucked my parcel under my arm and walked Maddox to the station. My spirits were higher than they had been for a considerable time. A month in Sussex digging up old rocks. What could be better? If only I had known. Maddox travelled to London the day before we left for Sussex, and we spent an agreeable evening admiring our fishing rods and speculating on what weather August might throw our way. I'd had more than a bellyful of the stifling heat of the capital, and Chandler assured us that Applewick was famed for sunshine, fishing, and folklore. The journey down to Sussex was a pleasant one. I'd sent Finch ahead with the baggage on the Saturday, leaving just our hand luggage to deal with. The carriages were surprisingly empty for a Sunday, and we spread out, shamelessly, across 6 seats. The stations of the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway are amongst the prettiest and most well-kept I've had the pleasure of travelling through. At each stop we were greeted with countless pots of scarlet geraniums and riotous hanging baskets. We alighted at Midhurst and travelled the remaining miles, much to the delight of Maddox, in a cart pulled by 2 donkeys. The endless leafy canopies shading dusty chalk lanes, and the hedgerows crammed with the white froth of cow parsley, more than compensated for the discomfort of my leg, and with every mile we covered, the mental grime of city life sloughed from my psyche as a snake sheds a redundant skin. I am not a Sussex native, but spent my boyhood at an ancient and well-known preparatory school in the county. It was there that the South Downs cast their lifelong spell over me. Those rolling hills of green and yellow, speckled with white teddy-bear-faced sheep, and the endless unexpected spinneys, carved the name Sussex deep across my heart. I'd not returned since the war, and in the intervening years my love had slowly turned to fear, lest the ugliness of conflict had torn the glory of my beloved county asunder. Nervousness fluttered in my stomach as we rattled round each corner, expecting at any moment that the spell would break. But, outwardly at least, the Great War had overlooked this proud county, though I knew that every town, every village, every other cottage had suffered, and suffered still, with a dozen sets of Sussex brothers taken on one day alone. But I had come to Sussex to escape such thoughts, to lose myself in her sylvan glades and delve into her past. The lost rings of Sussex had rekindled my love of archaeology until it became an all-consuming flame, an unquenchable passion which filled my days with a new zest for knowledge and exploration. Edward Tuppen, vicar of Applewick, would be long since dead, of course, but there may be a record of his other gleanings at the vicarage, and the thought of undiscovered treasures amongst a cleric's dusty library only fed my cravings further. Chandler had furnished me with another trove of books in anticipation of our trip, and as we trundled along those white chalk lanes, I read aloud from Brabant's Guide to the County. "Not far now, sir," said our driver. "Shan't be no more than 10 minutes. Tell me," I raised my voice above the rattle of the wheels, "do you know much of Applewick?" "No," came back the short reply, to the amusement of Maddox. Undeterred, I consulted my book. In Sussex, the suffix wick may mean a trading place or port, There is little evidence of the river ever having been suitable for large boats, so it has been assumed that Applewick, spelt A-P-U-L, was once... Does it say anything in your books about the fishing? I shook my head and took the hint, closing Brabant and saving him for later. We turned a bend, and as the trees parted, found ourselves gazing down into a small valley where a dozen cottages nestled around a tiny church. A glimpse of silvered river sparkled in the sun, a tantalising hint of coolness after the long and dusty journey, before it retreated into dense woodland. Cuckoo Cottage is only a short stride now, sir, just before St Cuthman's and along. The cart bumped its way down the lane, and I craned my neck for a sight of the church. According to Brabant, it was 11th century and one of the oldest in the county. No doubt the interior was appealing, but it was the churchyard entrance that drew my eye. The roof of the lich gate was balanced on 2 standing stones. Even from a distance, I could see they were carved with runic symbols, and I was about to share my delight at this outrageous display of paganism when something in Maddox's face stopped me. His eyes had clouded from within, as if an invisible but impenetrable veil had been dropped. But his hands refused to conceal what his expression sought to hide. They clenched and unclenched rapidly, repeatedly, and worried at the wooden seat, plucking at a splinter until it drove itself deep into his skin. He didn't even flinch. Maddox had become unnerved by something. Naturally, I didn't remark upon it, and instead attempted to distract him from whatever inner demon had grasped him. I shall be glad to stretch my legs. I fear all this travelling will take me a day or 2 to recover. He merely nodded and kept his eyes on the churchyard until we passed its bounds. His head made the tiny darting movements of a man keen to keep something in sight. But try as I might, I could see nothing to cause such anxiety. Not 100 yards later, a picturesque thatched cottage hove into view, and I held my breath, hoping this was our destination. Rough oak beams striped whitewashed walls, and the thatch had reached that stage of glorious decay that allowed the birds to nest, yet still, I hoped, kept the rain at bay. Hollyhocks and lupins nodded gently in the garden, and nestled in between the flowers I spied cabbages and runner beans. Beyond the cottage was an open stretch of heathland, with a sweep of river bending away into yet another copse. "Ahoy there!" The driver pulled by at the gate, and Finch appeared at the door. "There you are, sir. I was expecting you earlier." I gestured to the donkeys and allowed myself the indignity of being helped from the cart. The journey had shaken my leg more than I'd realised, and a hot stab of pain shot through my stump as I tested it for weight-bearing. I gritted my teeth and ignored it as best I could. "What's the place like?" I asked him. "Champion, sir. Prettiest place I've seen for a long time. You'll not believe your luck when you see out the back, and there's a fine tract of river for Mr. Maddox too. You hear that, old chap?" I turned to my companion, keen to gauge his impression of our home for the next fortnight. He was gazing up towards the church, the tip of its short, pyramidal spire and weather vane just visible amongst the trees. Yes, he muttered, and then with an effort he seemed to pull himself together and take in the cottage. "My word, this is a fine spot." I tipped the driver handsomely and left him to bring in the small amount of baggage, whilst Maddox and Finch pretended not to notice my grimacing with every step. The cottage had a simple layout. A handsome staircase in the middle, with 2 linked rooms on either side, and a wide kitchen running the width of the building at the back. Light flooded in from the windows, and my eye caught on a table that would do splendidly for my books and typewriter. A fine amateur watercolour graced the chimney breast, and on the mantelpiece were 3 photographs of men in uniform. One I recognised as Chandler, handsome before his disfigurement. and the other two were younger lads, brothers by the looks, and not yet 20. Tucked behind the clock, the edge of 2 telegrams told the usual story. "There's a bathroom and usual facilities upstairs, sir," murmured Finch, and I blessed him for his thoughtfulness as I sagged into the nearest armchair. I awoke an hour later to find dinner waiting in the dining room, a feast of delights provided by Chandler's sister, Mrs. Hobden, a thoroughly capable-looking woman. She was short, stout, and handsome, and I was amused to see a rosy glow appear in Finch's cheeks whenever she caught his eye, which was often. "There should be enough hot water, but I've always got a pan on the stove if you're needing more," she said. "And if you want anything, you only have to knock. That's my little room up there." And she pointed to a door at the top of the landing. "I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to have young gentlemen round the place again." She patted me on the shoulder and stifled a sigh. "So don't you be afraid to ask." I retired immediately after dinner, fearing that if I sat too long the stairs would prove difficult, and my recovery take longer than the few days of soreness I was anticipating. Finch had allocated me a room at the rear, for the view, he said, but the sun had already descended, so that would have to wait until the morrow. Despite my tiredness, my mind was still alert, so having removed my tin leg, I settled into an armchair by the side of the plump feather bed and lit myself a pipe. There is seldom, if ever, silence in a city. Even in the dead of night, there are revellers wending their way home with the rattle of the milkman and coalman, and there is the constant drum of trains ferrying the endless goods needed by the world's largest metropolis. One can never be truly unaccompanied in a seething hive of 7 million souls. But here, the sounds that wafted through the window on the warm summer breeze were distinctly non-human. The whirring of the Sussex cricket as he enticed a mate, the bark of a dog-fox, and the rustling of something scurrying through the grass greeted my ears. I sat with nothing but those sounds of nature and the sweetness of my pipe for company, until the room was lit only by the soft whiteness of the full moon. Her light spilt in silken pools across the floor, and eager to see her beauty in person, I levered myself up and hopped across the room, using the chair and a bookcase as make-do landing stations. The window was a typical Sussex affair, a peeping dormer of 2 minuscule sashes set into a cat-slide thatch that ran almost to the ground at the back of the cottage. I pushed the sash up to its fullest extent, leant my elbows on the sill, and peered out into the night. To my left was the heath, with its low grasses and gorse, and to my right was the inky blackness of the woods. But ahead of me, not 100 yards away and bathed in moonlight, was a stone circle with a solitary sentinel at the edge. Scarcely believing my eyes, I counted 12 stones. I thought I knew every henge and monolith in Sussex, yet here was one which had eluded not only me, but every other scholar. My eyes strained against the darkness, but the moonlight only teased me further. "Chandler," I muttered, "you beauty." The following morning I woke early and once again hopped my way to the window. I hadn't dreamt it. An ethereal dawn mist adorned the countryside, but the stones were there. I made haste with my dressing and was downstairs by 6:30, clutching the lost rings of Sussex and my new camera, an extravagant Kodak autographic. Finch and Mrs. Hobden were already sitting at the kitchen table finishing their breakfast. The enticing aroma of fried bacon, mingled with a freshly baked loaf, made my stomach growl in appreciation. "Please don't let me interrupt you," I said as Finch made to rise. "You were certainly right about the view." And then, unable to contain myself for a moment longer, I added, "Tell me, Mrs. Hobden, what's the story of the megaliths?" "The jurymen, you mean, sir? Well, they've been here since before the church was put up. I know that because Bishop Athelric tried to use them in the foundations, except they weren't having none of it. They, Mrs. Hobden? The jurymen, sir. Didn't matter how deep the bishop's men dug, they never found the bottom of those stones. Gave it up in the end. She said it as if it had been last summer, rather than 1,000 years in the past, and I was reminded that Sussex folk still think of William the Conqueror as a recent upstart. The jurymen? That's an intriguing name. Is it because there are 12? So it's said. And that tall one's the judge. You'll be wanting your kit then, sir? Finch scraped his chair back and swigged the last of his tea. If you'd be so kind, Finch. I spotted a bench by the circle. If you could lay my traps for me there. Very good, sir. I allowed Mrs. Hobden to impress a light breakfast upon me, and then headed out whilst Finch clumped about upstairs. The sun had not yet broken the brow of the hill, but the mist had cleared, and the day had a golden promise to it, as only a summer's day in England can. Despite the train journey and the long drive in the donkey cart, I felt refreshed and invigorated, both in mind and body. It was but a short ramble to the stones, and I fairly leapt across the heath in pursuit of my static quarry. Well, as much as a one-legged man can leap. The sky, still a pale aquamarine at that hour, was filled with swallows and swifts that darted after their own quarry. The air was laden with the heady scent of wild flowers and the sweet song of the birds, and as I reached the stones, it's safe to say that I was, indeed, a happy man. I made a beeline for the bench I'd spied from my window, not permitting myself so much as a glance at the circle until I was ready. With a deep, contented breath, I closed my eyes. Here you are, sir. Finch, good fellow that he is, had not only brought my archaeology kit, but a bag full of books, a small foldable card table, and a wicker hamper, no doubt at the insistence of Mrs. Hobden. He nodded towards the circle. What do you reckon, sir? Worth including in your book? For the first time, I took in the stones. 12. The shortest no higher than a man's hip, and the tallest as high as his shoulder, formed an almost perfect ring. Composed of dense grey rock with flecks of flint throughout, they were sarsen stones, rocks left behind as the glaciers retreated in the last ice age. I ran my hand over the closest stone, cool and smooth, and marvelled that there was no record in academia, as far as I knew, of this circle. Oh my word, yes, Finch, these will make my book all right. It's thought there were no stone circles remaining in Sussex, and few monoliths. The only ones deemed to be authentic are at Four Maidens Meadow. The rest have been lost by way of the plough and the mason. Finch proved an invaluable assistant, and for the next 2 hours we photographed and sketched each of the jurymen. It was thirsty work, and at 9:30 we settled on the bench and broke open Mrs. Hobden's hamper. I passed my companion a bottle of beer and a pork pie, and we sat in amiable silence looking out across the heath. Here comes Mr. Maddox, sir. Finch nodded back towards Cuckoo Cottage, and I spied my friend, fishing rod in hand, striding in our direction. What ho! I called, and raised my hand, helping myself to a particularly fine Scotch egg whilst I waited for him to approach. There was something about his demeanour that caught my attention, though I couldn't put my finger on what, and I suspect that Finch noticed it too, whatever it was, for his gaze never left Maddox. I hailed him again when he was still some 10 yards off. Down to the river? To my surprise, he stopped in his tracks and shouted his answer. Yes, I'll see you at tea. And he turned on his heels and made off, almost at the double. What's he going that way for? Muttered Finch. He's given himself an extra 3-mile walk if he's going back past the cottage and up by the church. Oh, you know, fisherman, he's probably already heard some rumour of a venerable pike lurking in a backwater. I thought you were partial to a spot of fishing yourself, sir. I'm more of a sit-by-your-rods-and-snooze type of fellow. Finch was still following the ever-diminishing figure of Maddox with a puzzled frown, and I asked him if something was troubling him. Not me, but I suspect Mr. Maddox suffered from an unsettled night. Ah, best not mention it to him. Perhaps the change of scenery has disturbed his equilibrium. Well, the thing is, I'm not sure he slept at all. Finch took a deep breath. And if you pressed me, sir, I couldn't swear he was alone. You don't mean Mrs. Hobden? I meant another gentleman. He gave me a stern look of reproof. They were talking for hours, and Mr. Maddox sounded fair upset. Another gentleman? A stranger, sir. You must have imagined it, Finch. Maddox is a newcomer to this district, he told me so himself. Now, fetch my sketchbook, and we'll measure juryman number 7. By midday, the temperature had risen considerably, and I was forced to take frequent breaks on the bench. Mrs. Hobden's hamper had been exhausted, and I suggested we return to Cuckoo Cottage for an early lunch, resuming our endeavours when the sun had passed its peak. We left our kit in the shade of the table, and traipsed across the heath to the cottage. It was slow work, and I relied on my stick more heavily than I cared to admit, for the previous day's journey had tired me to a greater extent than I'd realised. By the time we reached the door, I was sweating profusely from the combination of heat and exertion. "Mr. Robinson," Mrs. Hobden chivied me into an armchair. "You must be careful of the sun, sir. Let me fetch you some water." "Oh, thank you. It is rather hotter than I expected. I hope Maddox has found a shaded spot by the river." "Oh, he's up at the churchyard. I saw him as I went into the post office, and he was still there when I came back an hour later." "Was he with someone from the village?" I asked, ignoring the significant glance that Finch threw me. "I didn't see, sir. Now, you put your feet up, if you'll forgive the expression, and I'll sort out a spot of lunch for you both." No sooner had she left for the kitchen than Finch turned to me. But before he could speak, I forestalled him. "Doubtless there's a logical explanation, but if there isn't, it's no concern of ours. Maddox clearly has his reasons for not mentioning his old acquaintance." "Of course, sir. Beg pardon, sir. I'll just see if Mrs. Hobden wants me to lay the table." I stretched out my leg and rubbed at the leather strapping beneath my trouser. Something was chafing away at the skin. A grass seed, no doubt, had worried its way behind the binding. It demanded immediate attention, else it would generate a sore, so I hastened upstairs to deal with it. Maddox's room overlooked the lane, and as I passed, and the door being opened, I happened to glance in at his window. In that second, I caught sight of Maddox hurrying towards the cottage. Had it not been for something in his affect, I would have thought nothing of it. But again, I paused and kept my eye upon him. It was not so much the speed of his walk that drew my attention, but the manner of it. There was a strange element of furtiveness to it, and every few paces he half turned and made a glance behind. Twice I had the impression that what he saw caused him alarm, for he doubled his momentum until he was practically trotting. As he drew closer, I realised his jaw was slack, and there was upon him the visage of a man in the grip of a tormenting, paralysing fear. There was no one behind him, though my view was limited from the landing, yet I formed the distinct impression that he was being followed. The word "stalked" sprang unbidden to my mind. It was a disquieting thought. Having attended to my leg, I returned to the sitting room where I found Maddox staring out at the stones. "Given up on your fish?" I asked him, and he spun round, startled. "Oh, it's you, Robinson. Yes, too hot for them. Me, too. I'll give it an hour after lunch to cool down a bit, and then come and have a squiz at my new Stonehenge." He stared at me, straight-faced with that haunted look in his eye, and then turned back to the window. "What do you know of the legend concerning the circle?" He tapped a packet of gull wire against the back of his hand and lit one. The pungent tang of the French cigarette wafted across the room, before it settled, wraith-like, in the corner. Little more than the bare bones so far. Mrs. Hobden has furnished me with the name, and I am hoping there's more information in my book, and if not there, then up at St. Cuthman's. I declined his offer of a gasper and took out my pipe and tobacco pouch. What do you make of it? The church? He took a deep draw on his cigarette and squinted up at the sun. I haven't seen it yet. A cloud of exhaled smoke enveloped his face, and he continued to stare at the sky, making it impossible to read him. Perhaps he'd misunderstood and assumed I meant the interior. I fancy taking some pictures of that lich gate with my new camera. The supports look like standing stones to me. Did you see anything of them when you were up there? He whirled round and gave me a false 9 glare. I haven't been near the church, I tell you. Stung, I averted my gaze, as one would to placate an angry dog. I fussed over my pipe and wondered how close Maddox was to the wrong side of sanity. Ah, well then, that's a treat that awaits us. I pointed out the circle, keen to diffuse the unexpected tension. You see the 12 low boulders? Those are the jurymen, and the solitary stone is the judge. One wonders whether there is any deeper significance to the appellation. Perhaps it was used as an early court where miscreants were heard by their peers. There's a slight indentation on the judge stone. It could be that those found guilty were executed there, and some folk memory lingered in the name. These ancient practices leave more tokens in our modern world than is often realised. He muttered something under his breath and turned away from the window. I was saved from addressing his rudeness by Mrs. Hobden calling us to lunch. The meal was a triumph of home-baked bread and pastry, along with some superlative tomatoes supplied by the vicarage. The vicar's well known for his toms. He never fails to win prizes at the local shows. Mrs. H. smiled her approval at our cleared plates. I fear we'll soon empty your larder, Mrs. Hobden, I laughed, taking out my pocket-knife and setting about an early apple. Is this a Devonshire Quarrenden? The beauty of Bath, sir, she replied. My great-grandfather planted them himself. Your family has been here for generations, then? Chandler suggested something of the sort when he sold me that book. The Chandler branch are incomers. They weren't here before the 1500s, but we're Applebys on our mother's side, sir, and they've been here since I don't know when. Then you're familiar with the older stories of the Stone Circle? I prompted. She gathered the empty plates onto a tray, and I sensed a reluctance to impart the information. Rest assured, Mrs. Hobden, I ask only as an archaeologist and not as some idle tittle-tattler. That seemed to reassure her, for I had met many people who were oddly ashamed of their connection to ancient English folklore, a remnant of the Victorian, perhaps even Cromwellian morality that sought to distance itself from unseemly medieval hijinks. We settled ourselves in the living room, accompanied by a final pot of lunchtime tea, and with the encouragement of Finch, on whom I couldn't help but notice she lavished her most twinkling of smiles, Mrs. Hobden began to tell us the tale of the judge and the jurymen. Maddox took up his newspaper, rather rudely, and paid us no heed. The early history was as I'd surmised, a forum for local trials and the settling of disputes. It was widely held that sentencing had taken place on the sentinel stone known as the judge. Executions had stopped once the church established its dominance, but the informal public court continued well into the late 19th century, not 50 years before, with the contested property, including the occasional wayward wife, placed upon the judge stone. But what of recent times? I asked her, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I'm sure I don't know anything about that, sir. It wouldn't do for the vicar to hear of such things. You are among friends here, Mrs. Hobden. I assure you that nothing you say will be mentioned to the vicar. Be a shame to lose access to those tomatoes, added Finch. Quite, Finch, quite. And to my amazement, he treated Mrs. H to a wink. There followed a good 10 minutes of gentle persuasion, where I tried to coax the information from her. You won't put it in your book, sir, No names, no pactral, Mrs. Hobden. Oh, my boys used to say that. Her lip quivered, and I feared I had lost her. But she took a shuddering breath and nodded her head. All I can tell you is what I've seen for myself. It was when the war started. She steadied her nerves with a gulp of tea and launched into her tale. There was a group of people from the village, from the older families mostly, that wanted to help with the war effort. And it was suggested we go down to the circle and ask for a blessing for our Tommies out at the front. Make sure they were looked after and treated right. No disrespect, sir, not to the officers in the trenches, because we didn't know then how much they suffered too. We thought it was like working for the gentry back home. All we wanted was our men and boys watched out for. So you petitioned for this from the judge and the jurymen? I asked, and noticed Maddox lowered his paper somewhat. That's right, just at the full moon at first. And then, once we heard how bad it was at the front, we went every quarter moon. And how many of you were there? About a dozen at the start. But then, after the Somme... Her voice cracked, and she fished in her sleeve for a handkerchief. After the Somme, the numbers grew, until by the end of the war, it was nigh on the whole village. I don't know how we kept it from the vicar. Good Lord, breathed Maddox. No, we were very careful, sir. We never asked for the Germans to be killed or anything. I mean, they're other people's sons too, aren't they? We asked for what was fair and just. Nothing more, nothing less. And since the war finished, there was no need to carry on, but some people... She glanced out the window and took another slow, deep breath. Some people say we woke the stones up. Silly. I know, but there you are. How do you mean, woke 'em up? Finch paused in the polishing of my boots. They say that after all these years of being ignored, the jurymen took in all our energy. Absorbed was the word, sir. And, oh, take no notice, it's too fanciful for words. She stood up and brushed an invisible crumb from her apron. No, Mrs. Hobden, go on, please. Well, it's said since then, the stones seek justice on their own. You mean they no longer have to be asked? The stones have taken on the ability to administer justice of their own? I asked her. So some people believe, sir. There, I've made myself look foolish. She picked up the tea things and bustled back to the kitchen. I hadn't realised there was still so much primitive belief in England. Maddox lit another gasper and puffed away, his trembling fingers scattering ash on Mrs. Hobden's rug. Well, I don't mind admitting I felt an atmosphere round those stones this morning. Finch huffed on my boot leather and buffed it with his cloth. Is it primitive? I'm not so sure. The power of collective thought is well documented throughout history, right up to the present day, and many objects are considered cursed in some way. This is just an extension of that. I relit my pipe and watched a bead of sweat appear on Maddox's forehead. But what are you saying? He insisted. That rocks can somehow alter events and mete out justice to those deserving of it. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, I quoted. The war has created a vast interest in spiritualist matters. All that must collect somewhere. The desperation, the hope, the fear, the agony of grief. Perhaps the stones have amassed that energy and produced a tangible aura. Seems no different to me than some rocks being magnetic, added Finch. No wonder there's a queer feel to this whole place. I have to agree, yet I don't find it unpleasant. When we came past the church, for example, Maddox leapt up and threw his cigarette into the fireplace. I've never heard such superstitious nonsense. Energies and auras. It's one thing for the local peasantry to believe such things, but good God, Robinson, you went to Oxford. He snatched up his newspaper and charged for the door. knocking an ornament from a small table in his rush to leave the room. The china figure landed on the brick hearth and smashed. The noise arrested his flight, and he stared at the fragments as Mrs. H. rushed in. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hobden. I hope it wasn't valuable." "Not valuable, no, sir. Not in the way you mean." She bent down to retrieve the scattered shards. When she stood, her face was white. "It was a present from one of my boys, before he went off to fight." I scrambled to my feet and took the pieces into my handkerchief, tying the corners into a makeshift bag. "It's not too badly broken. There must be some glue around somewhere. Here, Finch, your eyesight's better than mine." I handed it across, and to my horror, Mrs. Hobden's eyes filled with tears. Maddox stood there with an air of disinterest, and I felt a sudden surge of dislike for him. There had always been an undercurrent of callousness about him at Oxford. As his closest friend, I rarely suffered from it, but tales of jealousy and malice still reached my ears. Seeing him so unmoved by Mrs. Hobden's obvious distress, I wondered if I'd been wrong to dismiss those earlier rumours. I steered her into the kitchen, and in the traditional English manner of dealing with unpleasantness, busied myself with tea-making, whilst Finch searched beneath the sink for a pot of glue. "Don't you fret, Mrs. H," he said. "It's a clean break. It'll be no more than 10 minutes to have it as good as new." She dabbed at her eyes with her hanky and nodded. "You don't think so? You don't think it's because we were talking about the jurymen?" "No, I don't. Not at all. It's because Maddox is a clumsy oaf." Finch set to work repairing the china, and I made a hearty joke of being unable to boil a kettle, and Mrs. Hobden soon recovered herself. The heavy footsteps of Maddox creaked the boards above our heads, settling into the rhythm of a man pacing. We fell to silence, listening as he paused repeatedly at the window, before resuming his slow, constant tread. "Seems to me, sir," Finch dabbed another piece of pottery with a glue brush, "that Mr. Maddox has something on his mind. Perhaps some fresh air will help loosen it." I finished my tea, and having assured Mrs. H. that her china dove would soon be all square, I left them to it and set about convincing Maddox to accompany me in my work at the Circle. He took some persuading, but I rebuffed his excuses, and we at last set out for the stones. I noticed a strip of bandage around his thumb, and I inquired about his injury. "You're Mr. Potsherd, and I cut myself on it. You know, Robinson, I feel dashed sorry that I broke her ornament." "I'm sure Finch will repair it successfully," I assured him stiffly, feeling his remark was more due to a sense of propriety than sorrow. I changed the subject, and we fell to discussing the village of Applewick. He was keen, I noticed, to avoid any mention of the villagers' wartime dabblings with the occult, if indeed it merited such a dramatic description. The heat of the day had passed, and the air was taking on that warm, creamy glow that only an August afternoon can. There was not a breath of wind, and almost at the Circle I paused for a moment, leaning on my cane to rest my leg. Something slithered away in front of me, slinking from one gorse bush to another. An adder, and I remarked upon the beauty of its markings to my companion. Receiving no reply, I turned, and to my astonishment found that Maddox was some distance back. I'd made good headway with my walk, but I had hardly sprinted enough to leave a fit man behind, and I wondered if an unusual butterfly or insect had distracted him. However, he was not examining the heath, but instead was stock still. "Did you hear that?" His voice was little more than a hoarse whisper, but the sound travelled in the stillness. I shook my head, about to ask if he had heard the call of a rare bird, when I caught his expression. Once more, his jaw had grown slack and fallen open, and his skin had taken on an unpleasant grey hue. "Are you ill?" I made towards him, but with every step I took, he retreated one further. A sheen of perspiration wet his brow, and he removed his hat to dab at his forehead with his handkerchief. I must go back to the cottage." "Why? What did you hear?" I called. But he was already hurrying away, stumbling over the clumps of heather in his haste. His hat fell from his hand, and he left it where it landed. I glanced round me, but could see nothing which would elicit such terror, for terror it was. I'd seen enough of it in the trenches to recognise a man whose reason was hanging by an unravelling thread. I kept my eye on him until he reached the cottage, where no doubt Finch and Mrs. Hobden would attend to him, and then I carried on to the stones. Had our talk of the wartime rituals unnerved Maddox? There are people who find such things distasteful, and more who find them discomforting. But I had never thought Thomas Maddox affected by suggestion. Many a night, whilst studying in Oxford, we'd sought to outdo one another with candle-lit tales of the macabre, with Tom conjuring such stories of lurid murder and vengeance from beyond the grave that even my hands shook when I turned out the light at bedtime. Applewick and the Jurymen had agitated him, and agitated him close to a breakdown. The long journey from London and my enthusiastic walks across the rugged heath took their toll, and my leg exacted a ferocious revenge the next day. My stump had grown hot in the night, and by breakfast time I was unable to bear weight on my prosthesis. I was reduced to crutches for the foreseeable future. Finch set up a chair and table close to the house, and ferried books and tobacco back and forth, and Mrs. H. fed and watered me with all the care of a hothouse orchid. Maddox seemed unwilling to spend any time alone, and dogged our every move, while his fishing rods lay wrapped up, untouched, in the hall. After a prolonged bout of what can only be described as twitching moroseness, he seemed to have won the battle with his nerves, and visibly relaxed. I had been confined to barracks for 3 days when I felt I could broach the subject of the jurymen. "Have you been to view the stones yet?" I asked, reaching for my pipe and the tobacco jar. "Not close to," he admitted. "It's the strangest thing, but I'm not sure I like them. Or rather, that they like me. It's not that unusual. There are plenty of documented cases of things affecting one's auric field. There's a theory that each person's chemical makeup, which is as individual as a fingerprint, reacts to the chemicals of its surroundings." "You mean the jurymen object to the fillings in my teeth?" "Something like that, yes," I laughed. "Pass me your lighter, there's a good chap." He fished through his pockets. "Must have left it in my room." "That's it there, isn't it?" And I pointed to the round trench lighter on the other side of the table. "No, must belong to Finch." He picked it up and was about to pass it to me when his hand faltered. "Where did you get this?" "It's not mine. As you say, must belong to Finch." "What regiment was he in?" "Royal West Kent. I say, Maddox, is something the matter?" Instinctively, I reached over for my crutches and began to rise from my chair. He tried to laugh, but only managed a half-strangled cry as he flung the lighter at me. Taken aback, I sank into my seat and groped for the object that had offended him so. It was a typical brass lighter, fashioned by a soldier in the trenches, a common enough pastime amongst the Tommies. The insignia of the Duke of Cambridge's own, the Middlesex regiment, was carved, rather skillfully, into the brass. "Middlesex? Wasn't that your outfit?" But he had already retreated to Cuckoo Cottage. Turning the lighter over, I saw H. Maddox scratched into the case. No wonder he'd reacted the way he had. Hugh was one of the brothers he'd lost at Passchendaele. I gathered my wits and returned to the cottage, only to be met by Mrs. Hobden at the door. "Mr. Maddox is in a bit of a state, sir. I'm not sure what he was talking about, but he's very upset about something." "Thank you, Mrs. H. I expect it's a touch of the sun. I'll have a word with him." "Shall I put the kettle on, sir?" I nodded, and propping my crutches against the wall, hopped up the stairs. Maddox was pacing in his room with a look of absolute thunder on his face. He rounded on me as soon as he saw me. "If this is some kind of joke—" "Joke? If Finch accidentally picked up your lighter, then I apologise. I can only assume he spotted it on the table and thought it was mine." "Oh, come on." He rolled his eyes. "He's obviously pinched it. I hope you're not insinuating that Finch stole it." My temper flared, and Maddox was lucky I was having to lean against the doorframe, else I might have taken him more firmly to task. He must have caught the glint in my eye, for he immediately apologised, sinking onto the bed with his head in his hands. "The thing is, Robinson," he said at last, "I haven't seen that lighter since it was in the hand of my brother. If he didn't steal it, Finch must be playing some sort of appalling practical joke. I can't think how else it could come to be here. Now look here, I'll grant it was a shock to see it, but I'll not have you slandering my man's name. There's obviously a reasonable explanation. He came across it somewhere, a pawnbroker's or some such, and was going to present it to you." It sounded implausible, but to my surprise, he grasped my hypothesis with both hands, like a drowning man. Yes, of course. Someone found it after the battle, some local scavenger or despoiler, perhaps another member of the regiment, and it found its way to London." He slapped his knees with his hands and grinned. "Logical. Quite logical. I feel a complete fool. My apologies, Robinson, for doubting your man." He held out his hand for me to shake, and then realised I was unable to cross the room. "Oh, forgive me. What an ass you must think I am." I assured him there was no harm done, and after an embarrassing pause, we returned to the garden to make the most of the glorious evening. The sun skimmed the brow of the distant downs, and within a few minutes the valley started its descent into twilight. Lamps were lighted inside Cuckoo Cottage, and the silhouettes of Finch and Mrs. H flitted back and forth in the windows like moths. The hills grew darker, and where there had been golden sunlight but an hour earlier, there now lurked a sooty darkness. I lit a hurricane lamp and placed it on the ground behind me so the light wasn't in our eyes, and with a contented sigh lay back in my chair. "How quickly night falls here," he said. "A consequence of being surrounded by hills, I suppose." "Older maps suggest there was a tumulus on that ridge," I pointed with my pipe. "Long eroded, but on a night such as this, it's easy to imagine our ancestors coming to pay homage to their dead. Torch-lit processions passing this very spot, perhaps on their way to the Jurymen to petition for a good afterlife for their loved ones. One can almost feel their presence." The heat of the day had gone, but the deadness of the air remained, and the infrequent faint breezes reminded me of a person walking by. I laughed and said as much to Maddox. He turned his head slowly to look at me, and there was a seething mixture of fear and hatred in his eyes. It was nothing more than a flash, but its intensity shook me, and I was glad when he changed the subject. Even so, I moved my hand closer to my sticks. "Blast this cut. It refuses to heal." He picked at the bandage irritably, discarding it in a bloody heap on the ground, and pressed his handkerchief against the wound. "Perhaps you need a stitch or two. I'll ask Finch to have a look at it for you." Maddox didn't reply, and after a lengthy silence, I assumed he'd nodded off. I contented myself with watching the shadows lengthen and the aerobatics of the bats on the hunt for moths. "What do you suppose happens?" he said at length. "Happens? When we die, do you suppose our debits and credits are weighed at the balance?" Like most Englishmen, I am not outwardly religious, but instead have some intangible and deep-seated hope for fairness, for justice. I thought for a moment, choosing my words with care, taking my time as I relit my pipe, and I allowed the smoke to drift and curl in the calm night air before I gave him my answer. The weighing of one's actions is an idea that seems to have remained constant throughout history. Whether that takes the shape of an almighty, all-knowing judge, or whether the universe dispenses a more natural justice, I cannot say. But yes, I do believe that one's earthly deeds have consequences for one's soul. He took a long pull on his cigarette, exhaling loudly as he blew the smoke out, and was about to speak when he started upright in his chair. "Everything all right?" He was suddenly completely alert, a gun dog who sensed a fallen bird, yet there was no sense of ease in his manner. "Did you see?" His finger quivered and pointed into the darkness. I leant forward, straining my eyes against the gloom until the shapes shifted, taking on an altogether different significance. Maddox staggered up from his seat. "The shadows, where are they coming from?" He brushed at his sleeves as if trying to dislodge ants. "What is it? What are you seeing?" "Curse you, Robinson, and your endless talk of ghosts." He stumbled away and shouted into the night. "Come for me, then. Come for me, but stop this tormenting. Have pity. Have pity," before falling to his knees. I was up and over to him in a flash and helped him up as best I could. His eyes held mine, with terror etched across his white face. "Did you see him?" was all he said, before he collapsed into a dead faint. With the help of Finch, I got him back to the cottage and up to his bedroom, laying him on his bed. Mrs. Hobden placed a cold flannel on his forehead, and he soon regained his senses. "Maddox," I said, "I think we should send for a doctor. You seem to have had some sort of attack." No. His gaze travelled round the room, lingering in one corner. Would you put a light over there for me?" "I'll fetch another candlestick, sir." Finch raised his eyebrows at me as he left. "If you won't see a doctor, what can I do to help you?" "Just tell me, the other day by the Jurymen, did you hear the whistling?" "Do you mean a bird?" "No, it was a tune. One we sang in the trenches. My brother whistled it constantly. And tonight, did you see him out there?" "Out in the garden? Who do you think was there?" He took hold of my hand and gripped it, clutching me as if his life depended on it. "Hugh." "Your brother? But, my dear chap, that's impossible." He struggled upright and flung the flannel onto the bedside table. "You said yourself there are more things in heaven and earth." "Perhaps you saw someone from the village. A poacher wouldn't have answered your shout." He cursed violently. "I know what I..." He took a sharp intake of breath, and the panic resurfaced in his eyes. "Mimosa. Tell me you can't smell that." "I don't understand the significance." I got up and closed the window. "Ruth. It's her perfume. She wears no other." "And Ruth is..." "Hugh's widow, of course. It's Hugh's ghost telling me he knows I proposed to her. She turned me down flat. So it was all for nothing." He choked back a sob and buried his face in the pillow. "Look here, old chap, you've overdone it in the sun. You'll feel better after a good night's rest." I stood up and released my hand from his grip. "The lighter. Hugh's lighter. Do you still have it?" "No, I assumed you took it." "But I didn't. Don't you see? Where's it gone? How could it have..." "What you need is some peace and quiet. You'll be as right as ninepence after a day's fishing." Privately, I thought his grasp on reality was becoming more tenuous by the day. I blew out his lamp and told him to sleep. Finch woke me just after 3. "He's talking to someone in his room again, sir." "Can you hear what's being said? Is he speaking with Hugh?" Finch shook his head, and a flicker of something flashed behind his eyes. "It's Robert, sir. The brother he carried back from no man's land." I see. Well, I'll see how he is in the morning." "Mrs. Ogden's worried, sir. She thinks he might be dangerous." "I'll have a chat with her tomorrow. I don't think there's any worry on that score. Go back to bed, Finch. Try to get some sleep. Something jolted me from my dreams. A sound that quickened my pulse and made my fingers clench the bedclothes until my knuckles ached. A voice. And the presence of another by my bed. I lay for a while and listened, but heard nothing else. Perhaps, I told myself, I had called out in my sleep, disturbed by the day's events. But my racing heart and the vague, unsettling sensation of being watched told me otherwise. My foolish mind played tricks with the shadows, throwing light where there could be none, and darkening the depths into a swirling, throbbing abyss that promised another kind of hell. A return to sleep proved impossible, and at 6 I rose and opened the curtains. The sun had barely risen, and a blanket of mist covered the heath, shrouding everything in its nebulous gauze. It gave the jurymen the illusion of being at sea, trapped on a sinking boat with the judge at their helm. Gorse and bracken had been reduced to lumbering hulks, smothered in heavy veils until the imagination squeezed them into shapeless monsters. They waited for the unwary. But no assault came. The broom was motionless, with none of the constant roiling of a sea fret, nor the buffeting of a city fog. The sensation that time was standing still suddenly gripped me, and I found myself picking up my alarm clock and pressing it to my ear for the reassurance of its tick. It was as I was doing this that I spotted Maddox walking past the house. He'd come up from the lane, though where he'd been at this early hour I could not tell. I lifted the sash and was about to call out to him when he turned and looked behind. It was obvious he didn't like what he saw, for even from this distance I distinctly heard him moan, and then he broke into a stumbling run towards the heath. My heart beat faster as the mist parted like a torn curtain, for it revealed a tall man wearing the army uniform of a captain. He tracked Maddox with silent, unhurried steps, and I scrambled back from the window calling for Finch. Something about that dogged, determined walk told me we might be needed. "Sir, is anything the matter?" Finch flung open the door in his shirt sleeves, shaving soap only half scraped from his chin. "Maddox is heading for the jurymen, and it seems he isn't alone. Oh, give me a hand with these straps, will you? Will your leg take it, sir? Have you rested enough?" "It'll have to take it. I suspect Maddox's breakdown is nearing its climax. On second thoughts, you go ahead and keep in the mist if you can." "Yes, sir." He wiped the soap from his face with his shirt tail and rushed back to his room, for his boots, I assumed. But when he re-emerged, he was tucking his old service revolver into his waistband. "You can never tell with this sort of fella. He'll turn dangerous given half the chance." And he ran down the stairs 2 at a time without waiting for a reply. I fumbled with my leg for what seemed an age, though in reality could have been no more than 5 minutes, cursing my blundering fingers as they snagged on the buckles and twisted the straps. Finally, I stood on the landing, hesitating outside Mrs. Hobden's room, unsure whether to wake her. She saved me the decision, opening her door fully dressed for the day. "I didn't get to bed, sir. I sat up with my Bible all night worrying." She laid a hand on my arm. "You will all be careful, won't you?" "Thank you, Mrs. Hobden. We'll do our best. But you'd better stay in the house, just in case things do take a turn for the worse." And I made my way out as the hall clock chimed the quarter. The mist had thickened into a dense fog, impenetrable in parts, and it was holding the dawn at bay. A lamp would be no use, so I grasped my cane and kept my eyes on the ground, keen to avoid the tussocks and rabbit holes that lay in wait for my ankles. An eerie, otherworldly quiet had descended. The heath had none of its usual sounds. Nothing stirred. No birds, no foxes. Not even a current of air soughing through the gorse. All I could hear was my breathing, rough and ragged, It filled the space around me until it took on a life of its own. Until it was the fog breathing. I could sense it reaching towards me. It pressed against me, touching me with frigid, damp fingers. Fingers from the trenches, mud-covered. Dead man's fingers. Skin loose, hanging from the bones. Tattered, decaying strips caught in the barbed wire. Sweat broke out over my back as I stumbled forward. Beads of wet collected between my shoulder blades and ran like the river Styx down my spine. Something sharp whipped across my calf, digging into the flesh, and a low cry echoed between the white walls that encircled me. Had it come from me? Or was it the other men caught in the wire? Trapped as I was. I sank to the ground, and the barbs twisted deeper into me, wrapped around my leg like a fox in a trap. Another moan from nearby. Who was it? Was it Anderson? We had gone over the top together. Damn this smoke. Would anyone see us? Would the stretcher party be too late? Anderson! Anderson, are you there? I cried, flinching as a shell whizzed overhead. A burst of machine gun fire strafed the air, and the cries of desperate men grew louder. A man called for his mother, and I thought of my parents at home. My sister. I pictured her sweet face when the telegram arrived. Would they find my body and take me back to England? Or was I destined to remain lost forever? A hand gripped my shoulder. Thank God. I'm caught in the wire. My leg. There's another man nearby. Anderson. It's me, sir. Finch. Finch? I forced myself to look up, expecting to see nothing but mud and death. It's all right, sir. It's all right. We're home, in England. There's no wire. It's just gorse. It's just gorse. The smoke thinned, becoming fog again. Home? My breathing softened, and I closed my eyes for a moment as reality returned. Yes. Yes, of course. Thank you. It's the fog, sir. I'm buggered if I can make out a blessed thing, that we can't be far from the circle. He untangled me from the gorse bush where I'd fallen and helped me up. Remember? Maddox and the jurymen? A despairing cry bayoneted the mist. Get back! Get away, or I'll shoot! Blast it, he's got a gun. Maddox! Don't shoot, it's Robinson. Finch and I are coming over. Are you at the Stones? Robinson, thank goodness. No, I'm not, accursed place. I'm trying to get back to the cottage, but I keep going round in circles. He won't leave me be. I exchanged a glance with Finch. It seems the fog was playing games with us all. Make your way to the jurymen. We'll find it easily enough from here, and then we can... There was a second cry, short and anguished, and the frantic scrabbling of a man running through the bracken as if the devil himself was snapping at his heels. From the direction Maddox was travelling, erratic as his steps were, he'd end up at the standing stones, whether he wanted to or not. Finch leapt off in pursuit. I followed after, chasing the sounds, no better than blind, stumbling and cursing my way across the heath. My heart thumped as the grass thrashed against my leg. The memories of other cries skittered at the edge of my mind. I gripped my cane, pressing the bamboo into my palm, and tracked Finch like a bloodhound, emptying my thoughts of any other purpose. The ground rose, a long, low hummock I'd scarcely registered in daylight. Here the mist had thinned with a conjurer's flourish, but the low-lying land was still bathed in white. Tom Maddox stood not 5 yards from the juryman's circle, his back to us, his gun hanging at his side. Finch was bringing up the rear, revolver at the ready, and I gestured to my left. He nodded his understanding and melted off into the mist. Maddox, He didn't turn round, and instead loosed off another shot. "He's out there. Why won't he show himself properly? Why does he skulk so?" I had almost forgotten the man that was following him. "Who is it? I can't see anyone." I approached slowly, making as much noise as I could, lest I take him by surprise and earn myself a bullet in the process. He squinted across the heath where the fog still lay doggo, and then turned to look at me. His skin was slick with sweat, and there was a wild, feverish glint in his eyes. "Who's there?" I asked him. He stared at me as if the answer was obvious, and I was a fool not to understand. "It's him," he whispered. "Hugh." "You can't mean your brother." From the corner of my eye, a figure approached. Finch, no doubt. "Listen, Maddox, Hugh's dead." "You think I don't know that? You think I don't know?" He ran a trembling hand over his mouth and smothered a laugh. It was a nightmarish sound, high and unearthly, made by a man on the edge of insanity. His voice rose to a shriek. "You think I don't know? You think I don't..." "Did you hear that?" "What?" He took a step closer to the stones, firing blindly into the fog. "Careful, there could be someone from the village out there." I sent up a silent prayer that Finch had stayed behind us. "No, it's him all right. Whistling that blasted tune. Tormenting me." He fired again. I'd been counting the shots, but he put his hand into his pocket and pulled out a handful of bullets, calmly reloading. "But Hugh's dead, I'm telling you. And I tell you I know that." He whirled round, and for a heart-stopping second, I feared he would shoot me. I rested my weight on my cane, telegraphing, "No threat here, just an old cripple." "Of course you know. Forgive me, I didn't mean to imply. I know that because I killed him. His ghost has come for me." "Maddox, Tom, you're not responsible for what happened to him. Or Robert, for that matter." "Oh, but I am. Don't you see? I killed them both." I took a step back. "You can't mean..." He shook his head at my stupidity. "I mean exactly that. I shot Hugh, and then I shot Robert." "Good God, but why?" "For Ruth." He sent another bullet into the mist and shouted, "There. I've confessed. Is that what you wanted? I murdered you. The pair of you. For Ruth." "Give me the gun, Tom, old chap. You don't want to injure a villager, or, heaven forbid, Mrs. Hobden. And you can't shoot a man that's already dead." He was plainly mad, and having just bared his soul to me, I didn't fancy being his next victim. "You can't shoot a ghost," I repeated, with a desperate appeal to the mathematician that he used to be. "It's not logical." He held my gaze for an age, and then handed me the butt of his revolver. I took it from him and glanced down, intending to empty the bullets from the chamber. A low moan stopped me in my tracks. Maddox was white, bloodless, and I followed his gaze. Standing by the judge stone was the figure I'd seen by the cottage. He wore the uniform of an army captain, the insignia of the Duke of Cambridge's own on the sleeve. The light shifted for a second. He must have moved, though I didn't see him do so, and I took in the jagged, brindled blot that covered the left-hand side of his jacket. My eye travelled, against my will, to the top of the stain, where a hole frayed the cloth. I couldn't take my eyes from that ragged, circular tear. It seemed never-ending, a bottomless pit of evil, and a tremor of fear rolled slowly up my arms. His face was hidden from me, and by all the gods I was glad of it. There was about him an otherworldly suffering, a magnetism of despair that radiated outwards from his gaunt, skeletal frame. You confess, do you, Tom? The soldier held Maddox's gaze and never once looked at me. Will you leave me be if I do? Will you stop your infernal haunting, the pair of you? It's not my choice to make. The soldier reached out and laid his hand on the nearest stone. The judge. A tendril of fog curled around its base, twisting like smoke. Higher it rose, reaching towards him. Another thread followed, and another. The strands rolled and curved themselves into links, weaving together to form a length of chain. Slowly, they embraced the soldier and tethered him to the stone. The final link, a molten wisp of white, crawled inside the tear in his jacket, and I gave an involuntary cry. Can you see him now? There was a queer, flat resignation to Tom's tone. Yes, I swallowed hard. I see him. Then I'm not mad. Hugh has come back to claim me. He sagged and staggered towards a rock, sinking onto it. Blood oozed from his unhealed cut and left a smeared handprint on Jurymen number 7. I loved Ruth from the moment I first clapped eyes on her, and Hugh took her from me. And your bullet took me from her, but she didn't love you, Tom. She never loved you. She loved me. So I discovered. I proposed to her last month and she refused me. She said she could never love another. There was pity in her eyes, pity and fear. I think perhaps she knew. But why did you kill Robert? I asked. He saw me shoot you. I hadn't seen him in the smoke, and I thought in the confusion. And you played the hero by carrying his body back when you're nothing but a murdering coward. It was the worst insult to a soldier, and he recoiled as if I'd struck him. No, not that. Never that. It was... Don't pretend it was guilt. He fell silent. I've come for justice, Tom. Robinson has heard you confess. You need to do the decent thing. The revolver weighed heavy in my pocket at those words. Robinson, please, give me 24 hours. I'll leave the country, go abroad. You'll never see me again. No, Tom. We were friends, still are. Surely that counts for something. It's not what we fought for. We didn't fight so that justice only applies to some. I took the revolver from my pocket, checked there was a single bullet in the chamber, and crossed to the judge. Hugh stepped back, still tied by spectral tendrils to the stone, and with a shaking hand I lay the gun in the smooth, shallow dip. It's this or the police, Tom. My voice sounded odd, detached, and for a fleeting moment my mind clutched at the thought that I was trapped in a dream or fever, even that I'd fallen and was lying concussed in some London hospital. But a sharp stab of pain in my stump brought me back to reality. Think of Ruth and your mother. Think what a trial would do to them. You can't make me shoot myself. He leapt for the weapon and grabbed it, raising it level with my head. And a dead man certainly can't. Slowly, I shifted my weight from my cane to my good leg, and pressed the small release button on the sword stick. More murder? For what? You haven't even won Ruth. I kept my eyes on his, and felt the cold beads of perspiration from my forehead crawl down my face. Your conscience will never give you a moment's peace. You'll never be free, Maddox. From somewhere on the heath came a lilting whistle, a tune we all recognised from the trenches. The revolver lowered until it was in line with my heart, and I tried not to remember the hole in the soldier's jacket. This is the easy way out. It's this, or the gallows. I shifted my weight again, and felt the sword slip its catch. I think we'll find there's a third way. He lifted the gun, and I said a silent goodbye to my sister. Better to go this way than drowning in mud. You'll never have a moment alone, Tom. I'll see to that. For the first time the soldier looked at me. I shall never forget the compassion that filled his eyes. The whistle rose and fell. What had been a cheerful melody in the trenches had become a plaintive lament, and Maddox pressed his free hand to his ear. The gun dropped limply at his side, his face a picture of despair. But I felt no pity for him. Unlike the soldier, his thoughts were only for himself. "I'll be with you day and night, Tom. Day and night. Forever." The soldier's chain tightened, drawing him closer to the judge, and the whistling grew louder, until it was close enough to be coming from within the stone circle itself. A soft breeze stirred what was left of the fog, and I could half believe an invisible breath had stroked my neck. Maddox screamed wildly and swung the gun back to me. In that instant, I knew he meant to kill me, but I hadn't survived the trenches only to be shot by a mad Englishman. I yanked out the sword and lunged at him, throwing myself behind a juryman as I fell to the ground. I felt a gelid resistance as the blade struck him, and heard the clean swish of an easy slice through flesh as I waited for the inevitable bullet. No shot came. I pulled myself up and peered round the stone. Tom Maddox had fallen face first onto the judge. A pool of crimson gathered beneath his head, and a low gurgle oozed from the gaping slash in his neck. His eyes stared sightlessly at me. It took a minute or two for me to collect myself, and then, with an empty stomach and an unsteady step, I stumbled back to Cuckoo Cottage. "Sir?" I shielded my eyes from the rising sun and spotted Finch lying some way off. "What on earth are you doing there?" "Got caught in a rabbit hole, sir. Can't get me foot out." He gave me a rueful smile. "Did I miss anything?" Mrs. Hobden poured out the tea and cut another slice of cake. "Well, forgive me, sir, but you look like you need it." "Thank you. The Germans aren't known for their Darjeeling and Victoria sponge." Hugh teased a sliver of cake with his fork. I couldn't help noticing that most of his teeth had gone, and those that remained were broken or looking decidedly loose. "It was my tobacco tin that saved me," he explained. "Tom's bullet glanced off it, but it was still enough to knock me senseless. The Jerrys found me in no man's land and carted me off to one of their slave camps. Tom, of course, assumed he'd killed me." "Nothing short of wicked." Mrs. H. grasped his hand, and he made a good attempt at not flinching. "I'd only been in England a few hours," he said, "when I spotted him with Robinson at King's Cross Station. When Robinson here explained what had happened to Robert." "It was a dreadful tale," I said. "As soon as Hugh told me, I knew we had to get Thomas to confess, and coming here seemed the ideal solution, but I didn't expect things to turn out the way they did." "Well," Mrs. Hobden shook her head, "even though I lost both my boys, and Chandler lost most of his face, I don't mind saying I was worried we were doing the wrong thing, and when my little china dove got broken, I thought it was a sign we should stop." "But your putting mimosa on the flannel was a masterstroke," I said. "How did you know Ruth wore that scent?" "Mimosa, sir? I didn't put anything on the flannel." "And if it hadn't been for Finch whistling that tune," I continued, "I think Maddox would have shot me." Finch's teacup halted in mid-flight. "Not me. I was stuck in that rabbit hole." A pause descended on the little tea party, and a cool breeze ruffled the curtains, tripping its way through the room. The hairs on my neck vaulted upwards. I carried on determinedly, ignoring the fluttering in my stomach. "And you took an awful risk, Hugh, coming to the cottage every night." He rested his fork on his plate. "What do you mean? I never came to the house once." And through the open window we heard the strains of a whistled melody, a song we all knew from the trenches.